October 14th, 1943. Pre-dawn, England. The hour before sunrise carries a particular weight at an airfield preparing for war. In the East Anglian darkness, ground crews moved between aircraft with the quiet efficiency of men who had long stopped asking why. The air smelled of aviation fuel, damp grass, and the faint metallic trace of gun oil, an odor that, once learned in this context, is never forgotten. Frost had gathered on the upper wings of 291 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, and the ground personnel moved with flashlights shielded beneath their palms, careful not to betray their position to any watching darkness. Engines coughed and caught and roared into the cold air. The sound built across the countryside, a low, compounding thunder that shook birds from the hedgerows a mile away. And men in leather jackets and fleece-lined boots climbed aboard through narrow waste hatches, crawled into glass-nosed bombardier compartments, lowered themselves into ventral turrets barely large enough to contain a man and his dread. They were sergeants, most of them. Farm boys from Iowa, machinists from Detroit, a school teacher from Georgia, a 19-year-old from West Virginia who had never fired a weapon of any kind before induction. They checked and rechecked their Browning .50 caliber machine guns with the practiced urgency of men who understood that today was not a day for mechanical failures. Then the flying fortresses of the 8th Air Force's 1st and 3rd Bombardment Divisions rolled toward their runways, one by one, and lifted into the sky, turning east toward Germany and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, a destination that, by the end of that single day, would become one of the most costly addresses in American aviation history. What the Germans defending that sky expected, and what those gunners delivered, was a distance of more than tactical surprise. It was a distance measured in ideology, in industrial capacity, and in the profound miscalculation of a military culture that believed it had already seen everything the air war could produce. It had not. To understand what happened in the skies over the Reich between 1942 and 1944, one must first understand the men the Luftwaffe sent to stop the bombers, and the world from which those men emerged. By the autumn of 1943, the German fighter force defending the western approaches of the Third Reich was, by any honest measure, the most experienced and battle-hardened collection of combat aviators on the planet. These were not men who had been rushed through abbreviated wartime training programs in the desperate years of national emergency. These were professionals who had learned their trade under fire in Spain in 1936, refined it in the skies above Poland and France and Britain and the vast eastern steppes of the Soviet Union. Some had been flying in combat since before most of their American opponents had finished high school. Men like Egan Mayer, who by November 1942 had already accumulated a combat record that would have been considered the stuff of fiction anywhere else, more than 50 aerial victories, a Knight's Cross at his throat, and the kind of cool tactical intelligence that separates a genius of aerial combat from a merely dangerous one. Men like Hans Philipp, who carried over 200 aerial victories into the autumn of 1943, and commanded Jagdgeschwader 1 with the casual authority of a man who had faced and defeated every variation of airborne threat that the war had offered him thus far. Men like Heinrich Ehrler and Walter Nowotny, and the hundreds of lesser-known but equally formidable interceptor pilots who flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, with an intimacy that comes only from years of continuous combat. The Luftwaffe's confidence in the autumn of 1942 and the first half of 1943 was not arrogance for its own sake. It was data-based. The early American bombing raids into occupied France and the Low Countries had demonstrated to Luftwaffe analysts that the B-17 was a large, slow, and in many respects predictable target. The aircraft were limited, initially, to formations of modest size, a dozen here, 20 there, and the fighter defenses assigned to intercept them were, in the opening stages of the campaign, more than adequate. The American theory of daylight precision bombing, that a heavily armed four-engine bomber could fight its way to a target and back without fighter escort had not yet been seriously tested against the full weight of the Reich's air defenses. And in the assessment rooms of Luftwaffe fighter headquarters, what one heard was a version of professional certainty. These would be manageable. These would be like the British daylight raids over France, only larger. The Americans were industrialists in uniform, the thinking went, technicians. The men behind the gun positions of these enormous aircraft were mechanics and factory workers hastily retrained. They would be adequate at close range, perhaps. They would fill the sky with bullets, some of which would find their marks by statistical probability. But under the disciplined pressure of Luftwaffe interception tactics, that was a different matter entirely. That assessment would need to be revised, extensively, and the cost of the revision would be paid not in reports and memoranda, but in blood at 25,000 feet. The first serious encounter between the Luftwaffe's experienced interceptors and American heavy bomber formations produced something that German pilots, for all their experience, had not been prepared to encounter: a wall. Not a wall of aircraft, though the formations were larger than anything they had previously seen against the Western bomber forces, but a wall of fire. Specifically, a wall of tracer fire from Browning AN/M 2.50 caliber machine guns, and not at the ranges the German pilots had calculated. This is the detail that carried the weight of the entire air war, and it is a detail that rarely receives the attention it deserves in broad accounts of the strategic bombing campaign. The Browning .50 caliber machine gun, as mounted in the B-17 Flying Fortress, designated the AN/M2 for aerial use, was not the same weapon as the German Luftwaffe expected to face, and it did not behave according to the parameters that Luftwaffe gunnery training had instilled in its pilots. And the American gun fired its heavy .50 caliber cartridge at a muzzle velocity of 2,910 feet per second. Its cyclic rate of fire reached 850 rounds per minute, and in the careful assessment of pilots who had trained against it and survived to report the experience, its effective air-to-air engagement range was approximately 600 to 700 yards, significantly greater than the effective range of the German MG 17 7.92 mm machine guns that Luftwaffe pilots used to range their 20 mm MG 151 cannon. This technical asymmetry had a consequence that no amount of Luftwaffe combat experience could entirely prepare a pilot to absorb. The American bomber gunners could open effective fire while the German fighters were still too far away to use their own primary killing weapon. And the tracers, phosphorus-tipped rounds designed to allow gunners to walk their fire onto a target, arrived at the cockpit glass long before the moment at which the German pilot's thumb could productively engage his cannon trigger. A Luftwaffe pilot who flew with JG-26, one of the most decorated and experienced fighter wings in the German Air Force, described the experience in terms that have been preserved in Donald Caldwell's authoritative unit history. He wrote that the size of the heavy bomber formations and the psychological weight of those formations could not be adequately conveyed to a new pilot before his first interception mission. It had to be experienced. The bomber gunners, he wrote, opened fire as soon as a target appeared, not at close range, but at range, specifically to disrupt and disorder the attacking pass before it could be executed. The Americans' Browning .50 caliber machine guns, he noted directly, possessed a higher muzzle velocity and a greater effective range than the German MG-17S that Luftwaffe pilots used to sight their cannon. The consequence, expressed with a simplicity that carries more weight than any statistic, was that fighter pilots' cockpits were already surrounded by red tracers. In the words of pilot Karl Boris, the rounds came swarming like wasps, long before those same pilots could open fire effectively themselves. And because the closing speed in a rear approach to a B-17 formation was relatively low, perhaps 100 miles per hour, yielding an agonizingly prolonged exposure lasting 15 to 20 seconds, this extremely uncomfortable situation could continue for what felt, subjectively, like an eternity. Some pilots, the account continues, would inevitably break away prematurely, abandoning their attack runs before delivering effective fire. The rest would pass through the formation at whatever angle and orientation offered the best chance of simple survival. This was not the picture that had appeared in Luftwaffe pre-mission intelligence briefs. The early American bomber formations of 1942 were small enough that experienced interceptors pressing determined attacks from the rear quarter could and did register kills, but they did so at a price that accumulated with every mission. The B-17E, the first mass-produced variant to see combat over Europe, had carried 9.50 caliber machine guns arranged to cover every quadrant of approach. When the bomber flew alone or in small formations, these guns were a serious deterrent. When the bombers flew in the interlocking combat box formation, a tightly integrated arrangement in which multiple aircraft covered each other's blind angles, those individual guns merged into a combined defensive field of hundreds of simultaneous barrels. A single combat box of 18 aircraft could, theoretically, bring something approaching 300 .50 caliber rounds per second to bear against an attacking fighter approaching from any angle except directly ahead. It was a defensive concept without precedent in aerial warfare, and it demanded a tactical response that the Luftwaffe did not immediately possess. While the first serious Luftwaffe response came from a man whose name is inseparable from the tactical history of the bomber war over Western Europe. Oberstleutnant Egon Mayer commanded the 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader II and had accumulated a combat record of extraordinary reach by the time he turned his professional attention to the problem of the American bomber formations in the autumn of 1942. In November of that year, in collaboration with fellow fighter ace Georg Peter Eder, Mayer identified and then systematically tested what would become the defining Luftwaffe tactic against American heavy bombers for the remainder of the air war. He had found the weakness, not in the machine, in the architecture of its defense. The nose of the B-17, its front quarter, was, in the early variants, defended by only 4 machine guns. And compared to the saturating fire available from the rear, flanks, and upper surfaces, it was thin, and approaching from the front offered the additional advantage of a closing speed so high, the combined forward velocity of the bomber at nearly 300 miles per hour, and the fighter at over 400 miles per hour, producing a relative closing speed in excess of 500 miles per hour. That the defender had almost no time to respond before the attacker had already passed through the formation. Mayer tested this approach personally. It worked with brutal efficiency. By December 1942, as the head-on attack, which American bomber crews would come to announce to their aircraft with the stark call of 12 o'clock high, was the preferred and increasingly standard method of engaging American heavy bombers along the western approaches to the Reich. The tactic required extraordinary nerve. At 500 miles per hour of relative closure, the German pilot had less than 2 seconds between the moment he opened fire and the moment he would need to brake hard to avoid collision with a 4-engine bomber carrying 30 tons of aircraft and ordnance. He had to aim, fire a disciplined burst, and disengage, all in the time it takes to draw 2 careful breaths. The most experienced pilots, as noted in the recorded observations of Lieutenant Colonel Bern Ley, he who flew a BB-17F with the 100th Bomb Group on the first Schweinfurt and Regensburg missions of August 17, 1943, throttled back slightly on the approach, slowing their rate of closure, gaining precious additional fractions of a second of effective aiming time. Old-timers, Ley wrote, could do nice shooting at 500 yards or more. Less experienced pilots were pressing to 250 yards or less, taking point-blank risks to achieve what skill could not. But the head-on attack, for all its tactical sophistication, could not eliminate the gunners. It could only make their task harder. The scale of what those gunners faced in the sky over Germany is difficult to fully apprehend from the vantage of the present, removed as we are from the sensory reality of high-altitude aerial combat. 25,000 feet above the earth, but in temperatures that fell to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, cold so severe that unprotected bare skin froze to metal in seconds, that gun mechanisms seized and oxygen masks cracked and the uninsulated floor of a waist gun position became a surface of lethal cold that penetrated through 2 pairs of socks and fleece-lined boots alike. The gunners of the 8th Air Force stood or crouched at their weapons and tracked incoming fighters with the deliberate calculation of men who understood that their life expectancy was measured, in late 1943, in missions rather than months. A pilot in the 100th Bomb Group, John Luckadoo, calculated a 400% turnover in his group in the first 90 days of combat. Most crews never made it past their 5th mission. The formal tour of duty was 25 missions. In the autumn of 1943, completing 25 missions was a statistical near impossibility for any given crew. A popular expression among the men of the 8th Air Force held that to fly in its ranks then was like holding a ticket to a funeral, your own. And yet they flew, and more specifically, they fired. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force dispatched separate formations to the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt in the first coordinated double strike of the strategic bombing campaign. 60 B-17Es failed to return to England that day, 36 from the Schweinfurt mission and 24 from the Regensburg mission. It remains one of the single most costly days in American air combat history. In the aftermath of the battle, just gunners aboard the surviving aircraft reported an astonishing 288 enemy fighters claimed as destroyed. When post-war researchers cross-referenced those claims against Luftwaffe operational records, the actual number of German aircraft lost that day was approximately 25 to 27. The disparity between claimed and confirmed is stark, and it has been used since to diminish the contribution of the bomber gunners, but to do so misreads the evidence. Multiple gunners firing simultaneously at the same target in the chaos of a contested sky, each recorded a claim that was individually honest. The collective overcounting was a function of the fog of aerial combat, not of dishonesty. More importantly, the overclaiming tells a different kind of truth. The gunners were engaging, and they were engaging at range, yet with sustained and aggressive fire that forced attacking pilots, even the experienced ones, to abort, divert, and recalculate. Adolf Galland, one of the most decorated officers in the Luftwaffe and one of its most honest post-war analysts, acknowledged directly that while the bombers' guns did not bring down large numbers of German fighters in absolute terms, their streams of .50 caliber tracer rounds formed an extremely effective defensive shield, one that compelled fighters to attack at suboptimal angles, to break off before delivering lethal fire, and to absorb the psychological accumulation of flying through hundreds of burning lines of orange light with each attack run. The defensive shield, in other words, was real. It was measured not only in the aircraft it destroyed, but in the attacks it prevented. Among those who paid the cost of underestimating that shield were men whose names carried enormous weight in the German fighter force. On October 8, 1943, during a fierce aerial battle over the skies of northern Germany, Oberst Hans Philipp, Geschwaderkommodore of Jagdgeschwader 1 and one of the highest-scoring fighter aces in the entire German Air Force with more than 200 aerial victories, was struck by defensive fire and killed. He was 30 years old. 4 days before his death, he had written a letter to his friend and fellow ace Hannes Trautloft, in which he captured, with a candor unusual in an officer of his rank and reputation, the psychological reality of attacking American bomber formations. Against 20 Russians trying to shoot you down, he wrote, or even 20 Spitfires, it can be exciting, even fun, as but to curve in towards 40 fortresses and all your past sins flash before your eyes. And when you yourself have reached this state of mind, it becomes that much more difficult to have to drive every pilot of the Geschwader, right down to the youngest and lowliest NCO, to do the same. 4 days after writing those words, Hans Philipp curved toward a formation of fortresses and did not return. Nor was Philipps the only senior Luftwaffe life taken by the defensive fire of aircraft that the German command structure had initially regarded as blunt instruments rather than lethal ones. Hauptmann Fritz Geishart, Hauptkommandeur of the 3rd Gruppe of JG-26, an ace with 33 confirmed aerial victories and a veteran of the Battle of Britain, was struck by return fire from American bombers on his unit's very first pass through a formation. The round entered his abdomen. He managed to break away from the battle and set his aircraft down smoothly at a German airfield. The ground crews who pulled him from the cockpit found a man bleeding heavily. Medical personnel at the hospital in Ghent worked through the night. By early the following morning, Geishart was dead. He had survived the Battle of Britain, the Channel battles, the grinding attrition of 2 years of air war over Western Europe, and the most intense fighter combat the era had yet produced, and he had been killed in his first serious engagement against American bomber defensive fire. At the tracer round, that small phosphorus-tipped projectile trailing a line of orange light through the frozen air at 25,000 feet had become something the Luftwaffe had not written into its assessment models. It had become a statement of capability. And that capability belonged not to a small corps of aerial gunnery specialists, but to tens of thousands of young American men from all corners of a nation that had been, in the institutional memory of the German military, at peace since 1918. The transformation in Luftwaffe thinking that followed from these early encounters was one of the most significant tactical adaptations of the entire European air war, and it reveals, in reverse, the nature of the shock that had generated it. If the B-17 gunners had been the minor irritant that the pre-war assessment suggested, the Luftwaffe would not have spent the years of 1943 and 1944 in a continuous cycle of counter-adaptation that consumed enormous engineering resources and demanded extraordinary courage from its pilots. Instead, what we observe in the historical record is a German Air Force in a state of sustained tactical emergency, responding to a defensive threat that had comprehensively exceeded its initial estimates. The first adaptation was the head-on attack pioneered by Egon Meyer, a response not to ineffective bomber defensive fire, but to the specific devastating effectiveness of that fire from the rear quarter. The tail gunners of the B-17 were, by the documented evidence of German pilots and post-war statistical analysis alike, the most effective of all gunner positions. Tail gunners, and who faced incoming fighters at relatively low closing speeds with the time to carefully track, aim, and fire sustained controlled bursts, accounted for nearly half of all enemy aircraft that B-17 gunners confirmed as destroyed. The ball turret gunners, in their cramped ventral spheres, exposed beneath the aircraft in positions that offered no protection for the gunner himself, but complete 360-degree visibility in the lower hemisphere, accounted for the second highest proportion of confirmed kills. The left waist gunners completed the triumvirate of the most effective defensive positions. These were not random outcomes. They reflected the geometry of fighter attack patterns. The positions most targeted by German fighter approaches were the positions that fired back most accurately and at the most advantageous relative velocities. And the Luftwaffe's response was to build around that geometry. By mid-1943, German fighter controllers were assembling dedicated anti-bomber formations using the Focke-Wulf FW190A8 in its Sturmböcke configuration, the assault variant, fitted with additional cockpit armor plating that added weight but offered the pilot some protection against the .50 caliber defensive fire he would inevitably absorb in the close-range killing passes that the tactic required. The A8/R8 variant carried two 30mm Mk108 cannons alongside its standard armament, cannon that fired shells loaded with 72 to 85 grams of PETN explosive filler, rounds so powerful that a single hit could be sufficient to separate a wing or detonate an engine in a heavy bomber. And the Sturmböcke pilots pressed their attacks to ranges of 150 meters or less, closing to near collision distance to ensure that at such short range the 30mm shells could not miss. This was not bravery in the ordinary sense of the word. This was a deliberate, tactical answer to the uncomfortable truth that American defensive fire was accurate enough at 400 to 600 yards to destroy a fighter that held its approach long enough to do effective damage at longer ranges. The Sturmböcke tactic, armor up, press to point blank, accept the incoming fire and absorb it with the cockpit protection, was the Luftwaffe's admission in steel and explosive that the .50 caliber gunners of the B-17 had forced a fundamental rethink. The German engineers also reached for the indirect solution, is arming fighters with underwing Werfer Granit 21 air-to-air rockets, 90-pound projectiles with 40-kilogram warheads and an engagement range of 1,200 meters. The rocket was not a precision weapon. It was a formation disruption weapon, designed not to destroy bombers but to scatter their formations, to break the geometric integrity of the combat box that made the overlapping defensive fire so lethal. Once a formation broke apart, once individual bombers lost the mutual support of their formation mates' guns, they became far easier targets for conventional fighter attack. The rocket, in other words, was built specifically as an answer to the collective defensive fire that no individual tactic had been able to suppress. It was an indirect confession of the problem's persistence. Staff Sergeant Bernard Sitek was a ball turret gunner with the 457th Bomb Group. On November 2, 1944, his formation was among a 1,000-plus bomber raid against the oil refinery complex at Leuna-Merseburg, one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in the Third Reich, when nearly 300 Luftwaffe interceptors rose to meet them. In his post-war account, Sitek described the moment with a specificity that carries the full weight of everything that had been learned and bled for on both sides of this air war. He acquired a fighter in his gun sight from approximately 600 yards as it began its attack run from the 7 o'clock position. He felt, he said, that he could almost see the bullets striking home. The German fighter continued to close. At approximately 200 yards, it appeared to stop dead in the air. It rolled over, and the pilot emerged from the aircraft. In a fraction of a second, the plane burst into flame and broke apart in mid-air. Sergeant Sitek, a man whose name appears in almost no general account of the Second World War, who held no commission and wore no medals beyond the standard campaign ribbons, had done precisely what the German aces had been told would not happen with the regularity that it did. He had killed, with trained, deliberate aim, at 600 yards, while himself sitting in a glass sphere beneath a 4-engine aircraft flying at 165 miles per hour through air cold enough to freeze exposed blood within minutes, with German cannon rounds detonating within yards of his position. What Sitek did was not an anomaly. It was not luck, though luck was never absent from any calculation at 25,000 feet. Yes, it was the outcome of a training system, an industrial system, and a cultural system that the German military had failed, in its initial assessments, to take at its full measure. The United States Army Air Forces, by the first half of 1944, was training gunners in facilities that combined conventional range work with sophisticated audio-visual simulators, the equivalent of the era, in an effort to build the muscle memory and judgment of fire control that aerial gunnery demands. The individual bomb groups in England supplemented that training with additional programs developed in the field. Programs built from the accumulated lessons of missions that had killed hundreds of men, but also produced an institutional corpus of hard-won knowledge about exactly how German fighters attacked, at what angles, at what speeds, and at what moments in their approach the gunner's window of optimal engagement opened and closed. The gunners who flew in 1944 were not the same gunners who had faced the Luftwaffe in 1942. They were the product of a learning process whose raw material was blood, and whose refinement was the relentless, grinding application of American industrial ingenuity to the problem of keeping men alive long enough to learn their trade. In the first half of 1944, Army Air Force's statistical records documented that 8th Air Force bomber gunners collectively required approximately 21,600 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition to achieve one confirmed enemy fighter destroyed. That number, taken in isolation, appears to suggest a modest return, but placed in its operational context, the chaos of mass aerial combat, the limited training time available, the mechanical challenges of operating precision weapons at extreme altitude and cold, the psychological pressure of incoming fire, the absolute impossibility of knowing which of hundreds of simultaneously firing weapons produced the strike that destroyed any particular aircraft. That number speaks to a collective lethal effectiveness that the Luftwaffe could not afford to absorb indefinitely. In 1944 alone, 8th Air Force bombers were credited with over 6,000 aerial victories. The combined figure of bomber and escort kills represented an attrition rate that the German training pipeline could not replace. The tracer round, that recurring orange thread stitched across the sky above Germany, illuminates something beyond its ballistic path. It is, in the story of this air war, at the visible expression of what America had brought to the conflict, in a form that no German strategic calculation had fully accounted for. Not merely industrial production, though the numbers of the B-17S rolling from the Boeing plants in Seattle and the modification facilities across the United States were already overwhelming German replacement capacity by 1943. Not merely manpower, though the reservoir from which the 8th Air Force drew its gunners was so deep that the losses that would have destroyed a European military's will to fight were absorbed and replaced in months. What the tracer round expressed was something subtler and more fundamental: the democratization of lethality. The German military tradition, forged over generations of professional soldiering, had built its combat effectiveness on the foundation of the expert, the highly trained, career-oriented officer and NCO cadre around whom conscripts could be organized and directed. The Luftwaffe aces who flew into B-17 formations in 1942 and 1943 were the product of that tradition in its finest form. They were experts in the deepest sense, men who had cultivated their skills over years, who read the air as a native language, who could perform the calculations of deflection shooting and angle of approach and energy management at 300 miles per hour with the fluency of instinct rather than the labor of conscious thought. They had earned their confidence. On what they had not fully credited was the possibility that a nation organized entirely differently, a nation in which the manufacture of competence was treated as an industrial problem no less tractable than the manufacture of aircraft, could produce, at scale and with speed, men who, though they would never match the individual virtuosity of a Hans Philipp or an Egon Meyer, could in the aggregate be more than enough. More than enough to hold a defensive line in the sky. More than enough to reach out to 600 yards and strike back. By the spring of 1944, the evidence of that democratic lethality had accumulated to a level that could no longer be explained away in German command briefings. Operation Argument, the series of coordinated American raids known post-war as Big Week, conducted from February 20th to 25th, yet 1944 struck simultaneously at German fighter production facilities across the Reich, deploying more than 1,000 heavy bombers in single missions escorted now by long-range P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, capable of accompanying the formations to their targets and back. The combined offensive of bombers and fighters in the space of 6 days inflicted losses on the Luftwaffe that no single week of the war had previously produced. German pilot losses during Big Week and the months immediately following were so severe that the training pipeline, already strained by 3 years of continuous attrition, could not produce replacements capable of the standard required to intercept effectively. The experienced aces who remained flew with the knowledge, increasingly unavoidable, that each mission sent them against both a growing escort fighter force and an improving bomber gunnery capability, whose lethality they had tested and measured at personal and institutional cost for 2 years. Egon Mayer, the architect of the head-on attack, the man who had looked at the B-17 and found its weakness and built a tactic to exploit it, a man who had accumulated 102 aerial victories and survived more close-range engagements with American bomber formations than perhaps any other single pilot in the Luftwaffe, was killed on March 2, 1944, near Montmédy, France, during an interception of American bombers. He was 26 years old. The precise cause of his death was never definitively established, but he died in contact with the formations whose defensive capability he had spent 2 years studying and fighting, and the man who had taught the Luftwaffe how to kill a flying fortress was killed within the operational envelope of the fortresses he had taught them to approach. There is a weight to that detail that transcends irony. The gunners themselves received almost nothing of the recognition that fighter aces accumulated through the war. They flew without the individual freedom of movement that permitted a fighter pilot to maneuver, to choose his engagement, to hunt. They were fixed in their stations, in turrets, at waist hatches, in cramped tail positions reached by crawling through a narrow tunnel, and their engagement with the enemy was dictated by who came to them, not by who they chose to pursue. As their claims were subjected to strict verification requirements, a destroyed enemy aircraft required a witness confirmation that the aircraft had been entirely engulfed in flame, or had disintegrated completely in mid-air, or that its wing or tail assembly had been observed to separate entirely, or that the pilot had been seen to abandon the aircraft. A plane merely on fire, trailing smoke, spiraling away out of sight. None of these alone qualified for a confirmed kill without additional corroboration. The standards were rigorous precisely because in the chaos of a mass formation battle, with hundreds of guns firing simultaneously at the same target, the accounting problem of crediting any single man with any particular outcome was nearly insoluble. Several gunners, by the end of the war, had nevertheless accumulated enough confirmed, witnessed, verified kills to qualify as aces under the 5-kill standard applied to fighter pilots. They were, as researchers Charles Watry and Dwayne Hall described them, the unknown aces of the Second World War, men whose achievement was real, whose contribution to the ultimate outcome of the air war was material and documentable, but whose names never appeared on the lists that the war's commemorative tradition preserved. The overall kill tally for 8th Air Force heavy bomber gunners across the European theater of operations, as recorded in official Army Air Force's statistical records, exceeded 6,000 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. 6,000 aircraft, each one a machine that cost Germany resources, production capacity, training time, and in most cases the life or combat effectiveness of a trained pilot. And each one reached out at 600 yards, or 400 yards, or 200 yards, by a man whose name the German High Command had never thought worth knowing. In the years after the war, in the reflective space that only survivors are given, some of the Luftwaffe's most decorated pilots attempted to articulate what it had felt like to fly against the American bomber formations at their height. The description that endured, that found its way into books and historical accounts and the oral testimony of men who had been there, came in the form of a metaphor rather than a statistic. One German pilot, translating his experience for an audience that had not been 25,000 feet above Germany, with American tracers threading the sky around his cockpit, and offered that attacking a B-17 formation from behind was like trying to make love to a porcupine that is on fire. It is, by any measure, the most vivid summation of the B-17's defensive capability available in the historical record, and it is vivid precisely because it comes from the attacking side. It was not written by a publicist or a historian. It was the expression of a man who had flown through that fire, had absorbed the experience in his body and nerves and memory, and had found no other language adequate to describe it. That metaphor carries within it the full measure of the German miscalculation, because implicit in the image, the porcupine, the fire, is the acknowledgement that the creature it describes was not supposed to be this dangerous. The original assessment had anticipated something less defended, less lethal, more manageable. What the German aces found instead, at 600 yards and closer, in the sky above their own territory, was a defensive capability built not from the genius of individual aces, but from the collective output of a democracy that had decided, with the full weight of its industrial and institutional and human resources, to be competent at the things that needed to be done. The tracer round that crossed the winter sky above Germany in the years between 1942 and 1945 was made in a factory somewhere in the American interior, Ohio, perhaps, or Indiana, or one of the hundreds of converted manufacturing facilities where the productive machinery of American civilian life had been turned, with the characteristic American confidence that one thing can become another thing, toward the requirements of war. Yet it was loaded into a belt of ammunition by hands that had, months before, assembled automobiles or household appliances, or any of the 10,000 things that a peacetime economy requires and a wartime economy redirects. It traveled in the bomb bay or fuselage storage of a B-17 across the English Channel and the Low Countries and the Rhine, arriving at the place where it would be needed at roughly the speed of sound, where it would emerge from the muzzle of a Browning at 2,910 feet per second, and draw its burning line across a sky that a generation of German professionals had believed was exclusively theirs to command. That line, orange in the cold dark above 25,000 feet, fading as the phosphorus burned through its brief life, connected a farm boy from Iowa to a professional ace from Kiel, and it measured the distance between two worlds, two systems, two ways of organizing human beings toward violent purpose. And when it found its mark, when it intersected with the engine casing, or the wing spar, or the cockpit glass of an aircraft whose pilot had never believed it could reach him, it delivered something beyond a ballistic impact. It delivered a message that the war was still being determined, that the sky was not yet decided, that the young men with frost on their oxygen masks and frost-bitten fingers on their gun grips were not passengers in the air war, but participants, active, dangerous, and very much alive. The German aces were right about almost everything they understood. They were wrong about the one thing that decided the war above the Reich. They expected to meet the gunners at close range, when it was already too late for most German fighters to do anything about it. What they met instead was accurate, deliberate, trained fire at 600 yards, from men who had no tradition of glory in aerial combat, no history of individual aerial victory to inherit, no storied lineage of fighter aces behind them. Only a nation that had decided, in the industrial and democratic language of its character, that any man could learn to do this work, and any man could do it well enough to matter. In the end, that decision mattered more than all the aces combined. Because freedom, at its most fundamental, is not the absence of enemies. It is the belief that enough ordinary people, given the right tools and enough time and the cause that makes the cold bearable and the odds acceptable, can hold a line that the extraordinary ones cannot hold alone. So the tracers that crossed the German sky between 1942 and 1945 burned briefly and were gone. But the light they made, the orange thread connecting a democracy's ordinary sons to the defense of everything that democracy meant, that light holds. It holds still.